Hi, folks, and welcome back to another episode. Today, we are going to be exploring the Moon card, and I'm very excited because there's so many different aspects of this card that we can really dive into that I think um, maybe seem a little bit out of left field. Um, but yeah, I'm really excited to explore it. It's gonna seem a little like topic jumping, I think. But I'm hoping that I've kind of like written things out in an essay like manner so that it's a little bit easier to follow and sort of see the trains of thought here because there's a lot of like elements of history or cultural belief that tie into the moon and symbolism and all that good stuff. So we're gonna get into it today. But yeah, very excited. And I thought this was like a good episode to kind of wrap up February because February has 28 days, I want to say. February. Number of days in February. I should know this. I really should trust myself in February. February. There's 28 days. I should trust myself more. Anyways, so there are 28 days in the month of February, and the moon cycle is approximately 28 days. So we're gonna dive into that. But I thought it was very like spot on, you know? So let's get into the card, shall we? Again, if you're watching on YouTube, I did my best to match my look to the card today. So I'll put the card up on the screen. And yeah, I'm playing with a little bit of blues, little peeps of green, um, some black and white, gray, that kind of stuff. You know, the shades of the moon. Um, but to go over the visual of the card for anyone listening, and for people watching who kind of want to know the different elements. So I designed this card to have a certain element, like a youthful feel to it. And I think that sort of it's brought up and elicited through the bedtime story depiction of these two characters working together to reach the moon and care for the plants around it. So you've got the background that's layered with the blues and the faint imagery of trees that are just kind of like hidden. Um, and the moon sits pretty centrally on the page. Behind it, there are these more like animated, drawn leaves that seem to be sprouting. And then, as I mentioned, there's two animated characters, one at the base of a ladder, holding it steady, as a second stands at the top of the ladder, reaching towards the leaves with their hand, with one hand, and then gently touching the moon with the other. Even the script on this card kind of has like that youthfulness or like an innocence because the letters look like they're kind of painted by someone young, like a child. Um, yeah, I really love the script of that. Um, there's almost like a childhood imagination, dreaminess kind of element happening. So another sort of aspect of this card's imagery that I really, really love is the elements of care. So you have the characters with like the mutual goal and this idea of like reaching for the sky, tending to nature. And that's emphasized through nature cycles. with the representation of the moon and its phases and the plants that will grow and die with the seasons. So there's also this kind of duality of the art that comes together in the scene. The moon itself, which is definitely the focal point, obviously, of the card, is more like a realistic snapshot. And the leaves and characters are more animation style, like I said. So this brings a really cool element of a back and forth between the real and the imagination, which kind of plays into the different aspects of the card as it is meant to symbolize more traditionally, I guess. So let's talk a little more about the card's origins. So there are a few different things to look at while we're examining the moon card. Firstly, we can consider that the moon is the first planetary card that we're discussing on the pod. And the moon, uh, like, it connects with astrology as well, the zodiac, but it is the ruling planet or celestial thing. um, of Cancer is what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to come up with another word, not thing. Celestial form. I don't know. Thing seems not as respectful, but and we respect the moon in this house. So, like I said, oh my gosh, sometimes I recognize when I'm filming these just how much I say so. Um, yeah, it's a lot. Don't make a drinking game out of that. You'll die of alcohol poisoning. Um, as I said, the moon is the ruling celestial form of Cancer. Um, so Cancer is often seen as like the mother archetype of the zodiac. If we're going by gender norms. So to remove the gender norms from this card, we have the elements of Cancer come up as being parentally nurturing, gentle, emotional, intuitive. Um, and while some of these characteristics play into the card's original meaning, the moon card may also have some general associations to our moon sign. So if you don't know your moon sign, feel free to look it up. All you need is your birth date to find out what it is, as opposed to rising, which you need the time for. But yeah, you can just look up birth charts and find out what yours is, what house it is, and blah, 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 blah. We're not going to dive deeply into the astrology of that aspect today. But all this to say is the moon sign is more of a critical look on our emotional self and like the depth of that emotional self. So if you wanted to do a little homework from this episode, you can definitely research that and see how it like might play out in your life. Yeah, but our emotional side generally has sort of our connections to intuition, our dreams, and this might be sort of like dreams that we have in our sleep, or it might be dreams like as in things we want to accomplish. But it also has connections to our subconscious mind. So again, that depth of self and sort of our reactions and emotional stability in a way. So And those are some of like the key elements of the moon card. If you know the more traditional meanings of this card, upright or reverse, it kind of brings up these ideas of illusion and delusion, not seeing things too clearly or just kind of projecting something you want instead of accepting what is. Um, and while this can be applicable depending on the other cards around it and the situation and stuff like that, if it does come up in that format, it might be like a tough love reality check type of card. Um, but I want to kind of examine that a little bit deeper from a feminist and disability perspective. Um, we're mixing it up a little, but I believe that it's important to be a little critical of things, especially things that have like held very tightly to traditional methods and symbolisms and depictions and stuff, because there are several things that were created at times where there wasn't enough knowledge on those topics. Even things today, you never know. There might be things that we discover later on where we're like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have interpreted things this way because we weren't taking into account this. Hindsight's 2020, which is why we're going to be diving into it a little bit more today. So, as a little bit of a like content warning, I guess, because I do think there are some elements of this that can be considered sensitive topics, especially for people who might have challenges and stuff within the medical system relating to mental health. um, I know it can be a bit of a sensitive topic, so we are going to be sort of unpacking some not so great terms that have been used throughout history. So just, mentally prepare for that if you're interested in learning more about the card. And if you're just not in a place to hear about it, that's totally okay too. You know, you can make the call, you know, parent yourself and decide if you'd like to learn a bit more today or if you're saving it for another day. All right. So, um, yeah, we're going to consider the word like lunatic, as we kind of like break that down. The word lunatic, you may think of someone who's like whack, crazy. Because not that it's like in our day to day vernacular now, but we've probably heard the word before. Um, and this was a derogatory term that was kind of a title for an illness people couldn't fully describe at the time, and they didn't have a lot of understanding for. So, yeah, it was just kind of like a blanket term for mental illness, which is not ideal, doesn't offer a lot of help, kind of ostracizes people, so don't love it. So, yeah, specifically for the word lunatic, the only real presumption from like a scientific perspective was that the the state of madness, aka the like severe case of mental uh, health challenges, mental illness, was caused by the moon. So this term was actually used by astrologers who would examine people's charts, and specific people who had diseases of the mind, putting air quotes around a lot of these words. They would find the causes in the placement of the moon signs. From what I read, especially in relation to Saturn and Mars more specifically. Um, I'm not an astrologer. I'm not claiming to be an astrologer. So, um, yeah, not like I know Mars is more so like the ag- aggressor, like the warrior. So there's elements of like violence there. And then Saturn is limitation and boundaries and stuff. So like potentially crossing those and sort of how like our emotional self i- interacts with those aspects of our lives. Again, not astrologer, so might be a little off with that. Very, very like surface level description, but that's my understanding. So, having had my own birth chart read and detailed back to me, I literally got 22 pages of information, which was like immensely helpful for me in terms of self analysis. But it came back with like, I forget the exact phrasing, but it was basically like the astrologer read my chart and went, oh boy. And I was like, yeah, yeah, I feel. But yeah, I feel as though astrologers then would have had a thing or two to say about my chart. And obviously, this terminology changed over the years to be a little bit less offensive, but we still hear some words that are repeated that aren't necessarily the most, you know, sensitive towards people who are struggling. So, yeah, but there are some more underlying associations that we can make to this card. There, you may have heard this belief a little more, but there's this idea that the moon has an effect on the living beings of Earth. So, um, though, like the phases through the phases, it kind of has some influence that remains to be fully analyzed or explained or understood, perhaps. Um, what we do see is like on full moons, there's a lot more activity in wildlife, which is unfortunately why we often see a lot more roadkill the day after a full moon or sort of like the days around a full moon. And this may be just simply explained away by there being more light by the full moon, which is an optimal time for wildlife to come out um, and do their nocturnal thing. But we also see human beings who have their own cycle matched up with the cycles of the moon. So the menstrual cycle, which happens to be on an approximate 28-day loop, gasp, another 28-day mention? Whoa. Um, like there's a correlation between that and the moon. And to break it down even further, the moon has these four main stages: waxing, full, waning, and new. The menstrual cycle also has these four kind of stages: follicular, ovulatory, luteal, and menstrual. So there's this belief, or there's sort of beliefs around. I've heard a few different ones, sort of like different levels of depth, um, basically describing the ways in which your own personal menstrual cycle might match up with the moon. So if your period matches up with the new moon, it's called the white moon cycle, where there's like a lot of strength and healing and renewal happening for you spiritually, which uh, kind of it correlates with the idea of the new moon and the representations of what the new moon does for us. It's the cleaning of the slate. It's the restart again, like renewal. Um, And yeah, this is sort of like a time to release, surrender spiritually. So alternatively, if your period happens on the full moon, it's called the red moon cycle, which brings about the creation of things and the motivation with that. So sort of like that idea of fullness, being able to complete things that you set out to do. Um, and it again kind of brings back that idea of the yin and yang, the ebb and flow of things, um, which I thought was really cool. So maybe, just maybe, you're wondering, where's the crossover between these two aspects? Because on one side we've got the early descriptions of mental illness being influenced by the moon. And then we also have menstrual cycles that are believed to be influenced by the moon. What could possibly be the crossover? Let me quote one thing. And if you're someone who menstruates or you're close to someone who does, maybe you've heard this phrase before and you're like, oh, it's all coming together. And let me tell you, I love it when it all comes together. Here's the phrase: you're so moody. Are you on your period or something? Insert the biggest ew sound here. Feel free to isolate that. Ew. I feel like that was a good one. Maybe I'll watch this back and be like, it was alright. But anyways, big ew, gagging sounds if you feel necessary. I don't know. But what I'm getting at here is there's this mysterious crossover between the influences of the moon on bodies that menstruate and the treatment of people who live in those bodies, especially when they act outside of a certain image that's enforced. So, more historically, we see a lot of like women's history and their experiences with certain cases of like acting out of an emotional place, or just being like not so mentally stable, uh, described as hysteria. And if you're kind of wondering, maybe you've heard about this or talked about this before, but hysteria, the hist is a prefix that we hear a lot in anatomy terms, anatomical terms, involving the uterus, ovaries, etc. So, hysterectomy, as an example, you've got the hist there. So hysteria is sort of like a term that was more specifically used for women. Man. Don't we just love history? Anyways, so when we consider this context, I'll be honest, it does irk me a little that, like, there's a lot of the negative ties that are linked with the moon card as we know it today. And while some of, like I said, while some of them are applicable as like a reality check, little like, hey, maybe you're not seeing things fully. It like, you know, we can see the moon card as a representation of phases. So in that way, it's not so much like, oh, you are just entirely like delusional. You're living in a state of like illusion, projection, blah, 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 blah. Instead, we can look at it as like the moon in its own right for what it represents with its phases, knowing that we may see some truth, but it may not be fully revealed to us yet. So to trust our intuition and the flow of our own phases of growing, things that might not be fully revealed. I realize I jumped around. What I was saying is, like, we need to trust our intuition. Being in flow, we've got stages of growing, shining, withdrawing, and resting that are all equally important. And as I mentioned before, like that idea of with time, things will be revealed. And it's normal to have an idea of what something looks like without all the information. As long as, like, with new information, that idea evolves and changes. So I also like this card as an element of representation for our connection to others in terms of our deep emotional selves. So tending to and supporting others in their pursuit of their dreams and stuff like that. Just, like, that's such an important aspect of what this card can represent, sort of that idea of, like, community, a common goal, mass interest of, like, aid, that care element, bringing dreams to reality. Or, you can look at it more individualistically and see it as, like, the caretaking of the subconscious mind. There are so many layers to the idea of the subconscious mind and the phases of yourself that I just want to touch on before we kind of finish up this episode. And then if you want to do your own reflections, you can. Obviously, I'm not going to stop you through the screen. But but yeah, like, consider what I said earlier in the episode about the moon being the ruling planet or form or entity or whatever. I still haven't found the word, of the zodiac sign of Cancer, who's seen as the mother of the zodiac. And then consider the phases of yourself that you went through to be where you are now. If you are in your full state in moon terms, then you are at a state where the light is illuminating all versions of you that had once been dark. The idea of that may be really overwhelming, and there may be things that come up from your past that need addressing. Things you thought you understood, but with where you're at now, your experience, your education, you can maybe see them in a new light. But that means that you will likely have to find ways to bring in, like, a compassionate, nurturing energy that we see with Cancer, the Cancer sign, and what Cancer represents to yourself and to your previous versions. How you may go about this. It might be depicted in the cards surrounding the moon card as it comes out. But yeah, there's so much you can explore with that and the depth of it. So I'd just like to kind of say, like, the traditional ideas of the moon card aren't necessarily tied to negatives. There can always be, like, a positive twist on things, but I do think it is important to kind of, like, more critically unpack the histories of words and associations, as especially in things that are depicted pretty widely. So The moon is such an interesting topic to explore as like an entity, and the not so fully fleshed out understandings of how the moon may have control on our emotions or our bodies or the planet itself. So, like, the moon has control over the tide, the push and pull, and that's wild. So there is sort of this like collective power to the moon and how it may help us operate in terms of like where we need to pull back, where we need to take a step back and look at things, or allow there to be time to fill in the blanks of the things that we may not fully understand because we're only shown a portion of the whole truth. But it also has this immense push for us to complete things, especially in like a community. There is like, I like to think there's a community element to this card in the same way that there is like a depth, to the self with this card. Again, how you read it depends on the cards surrounding it, but the idea that there is like some kind of illusion that must be broken, um, isn't the only way to read this card. So yeah, I'm thinking of, in future episodes doing like a few readings, or well, I do plan on opening Patreon, which will have different reading options, like card readings that you can subscribe to and have access to throughout the months. Um, where maybe you'll be able to see that, but maybe in future episodes I'll kind of discuss sort of the overlaps. Maybe in another season, once we're through the cards, we'll talk about sort of the overlap and what influences can be brought out or emphasized with other cards in the deck. So, looking forward to the possibilities of what lie ahead for this podcast. But in the meantime, thank you so much for listening. I really enjoyed unpacking this, and there's so much left that you can kind of explore within yourself with this card. So I invite you to do that if it is within your capabilities right now mentally, because sometimes it can be a lot of work. So consider what phase you're in moon terms. And yeah, I will see you next week. Bye.